Hello, and welcome to Writing Forward, a conversation show featuring some of the best and brightest voices from across Wisconsin. I'm Jeff Aloysia. I'm a former editor at the New York Times, a Milwaukee suburbs native, and now I'm a freelance writer based in Madison. Each week, I sit down with writers from and connected to my home state for candid, sometimes messy conversations about craft, identity, and what it means to build a writing life rooted at home and away from the traditional centers of the literary world. From fiction and nonfiction, poetry to journalism, we dig into what keeps Wisconsin writers moving forward, one word at a time. My guest today is Chloe Benjamin. Chloe is the author of 3 novels, including Understory, which will be published this September. Her debut novel, The Anatomy of Dreams, received the Edna Ferber Fiction Book Award, and if you're part of our Wisconsin writing community, you know how big of a deal that is. And her second novel, The Immortalist, was named one of the best books of 2018 by NPR, The Washington Post, Entertainment Weekly, and others. She writes about big, weighty subjects like time and fate and how we live knowing what's ahead, but always through the lens of close, complicated relationships. Chloe holds an MFA in fiction from the University of Wisconsin and was a longtime fixture in Madison's writing scene. However, in 2025, after more than 10 years in Madison, she returned to her native San Francisco. We're lucky to have her with us today. Chloe Benjamin, welcome to Writing Forward.
Thank you, Jeff. That was such a great introduction. I love what you're doing here, and you're such an important person in the Wisconsin writing world. So this is really a cool thing to offer to listeners.
Thank you. That's very sweet. I should say you are already the second guest that I met by approaching at the Madison coffee shop, Johnson Public House, which is apparently how I book guests on this show.
Which actually makes an appearance in the excerpt that I'm going to read from someone else's work. So Johnson Public House is truly a cauldron of Wisconsin writing.
Well, I remember telling you then when I first met you how much I loved The Immortalist and The Anatomy of Dreams. So I'll just say now, I'm reading Understory. I'm almost finished with it, and I'm blown away. I have so much to ask you about. But first, as you alluded to, we begin every episode of the show by asking our guests to share a brief passage from someone else's writing, be it a novel, poem, essay, or article that for them evokes Wisconsin in some memorable way. Can you tell us what you chose, and can you read it for us, please?
Yes. So I chose a book by Hannah Halperin called I Could Live Here Forever. Hannah was a student in the MFA program in creative writing at the University of Wisconsin a few years after me, and that was what brought me to Wisconsin. And this book is a really fun one for any Wisconsin writer because it follows a student in the MFA program at the University of Wisconsin. And so it's full of kind of touch points from that era, including Johnson Public House. So I'll just read from about a page toward the beginning of the book. I settled into my life in Madison. I made friends. I became closest with Vivian and Wilson, and I spent most of my weekends and free time with them. And we had so much free time. I wrote during the day, and evenings, Vivian and Wilson and I would hang out in one of our apartments, talking about books or what we were writing, the other people in the program, stories from our lives. There were also plenty of days I spent alone, taking long walks around the east side of Madison. Whole weekends working on stories in coffee shops. Johnson Public House, Mother Fools, Collectivo. Coming home reeking of coffee and whatever scent lived in the fibers of that particular shop. My apartment at Norris Court became cluttered with books and drafts and printouts of stories. I'd bought furniture from Craigslist in St. Vincent, the thrift store on Willie Street. I didn't buy a couch, but 2 massive armchairs that I put facing one another. One that was comfortable, and another one that sank so deep when you sat down you could feel the springs, but had only cost $5. The only thing I'd bought new was the rug. A plush blue and white floral patterned one from Target. Nothing matched. But it was the first time I'd lived alone, and I loved everything about my apartment. It had a working fireplace and built-in bookshelves and French doors that led into a tiny study with windows that overlooked a courtyard. Each time I walked through my front door, I felt peaceful, like this was where I was supposed to be. I didn't have a car, so I walked everywhere. My apartment was 2 miles from campus, and though there was a bus, I preferred the walk, no matter how cold it got. Walking was when I would think about whatever story I was writing. Sometimes I'd write out entire scenes in my head so that by the time I'd reach campus, I was bursting with sentences and images, entire conversations between characters. I felt lonely in Madison, but that was normal for me.
I love that. I love hearing it in your voice too. I think like there's something sort of symbiotic about hearing a Wisconsin writer reading another Wisconsin writer's work. I should
Yeah,
also mention that I lived in those Norris Court apartments
of course. Who
when I
didn't?
when I when I first moved back to Madison. I didn't know that they had this sort of pedigree as being like a place for MFA students and PhD students to live. And so I think Hannah's book was like one of three or four that I read in my first year back that mentioned Norris Court in
Oh
some
my
way. So
gosh. That's so funny. I actually never lived there myself, but the thing about Norris Court was that, it was at the time it was looking back, we would say it was really affordable. It was like
mhm.
$900 a month for rent, and there were two bedrooms. So like a lot of times people would share, and they would each have a study in addition to the two bedrooms. So there was a lot of space, and
And we should say for people who don't know, Norris Court apartments are these sort of like a series of low slung brick buildings on Madison's Near East Side, and they're very charming. They have a lot of sort of like wood details and trim, and each place has a fireplace, which I was told I couldn't use, but then people told me that they were using there. So anyway, it sort of has its place in Wisconsin lore.
yes.
Um, One thing that stands out to me about your books, I was thinking about this as I was reading Understory. I think with literary fiction, sometimes when people ask writers to describe the novel they're working on or what their book is about, you start to, and the person's eyes start to glaze over, or they can't quite get their head around it in the way that, like, maybe if you asked a mystery writer or a thriller writer. But your novels are what I would sort of consider like literary high concept. So they're deeply character driven, but they also have these really compelling, almost pitchable premises, which is pretty rare. Since we have you early in the life cycle of Understory, maybe we can use this as practice. What's your sort of elevator pitch for this book?
Yeah. Well, I actually think this is the hardest one to pitch because there's so much that I don't want to spoil for the reader. So I agree with you, and I love that idea of sort of high concept literary work. That's definitely what I hope to write. And I think Immortalists had a really tight nutshell that was easy to deliver in a sentence. And for Understory, my dream for the book, which my publicist was like, absolutely not, was like nothing on the jacket, no detail, just like go into the rabbit hole. Just open the first page and start reading. And
Love
of
it.
course, like, that's not going to work in our landscape. But anyway, the nutshell that we did come up with was basically an estranged couple unwillingly reunited on a research base in Antarctica discover a parallel universe that moves backward in time. Even that gives away too much, but I don't know. Do you have a better one? If you do have a better one, I would love to hear it.
I don't know that I do. I just love this idea. I can sort of see your team listening to you pitch a sort of synopsis list cover and just not,
Yeah.
nodding along very nicely and being like, okay, that's an interesting idea.
You're like
Uh,
messaging each other in the Slack, like, absolutely not.
uh-huh.
Like,
I think it is a really difficult book to hint at without giving much away. Certainly, the setting is evocative, and we should say there is plenty of Wisconsin in this book, but also, yeah, it takes place on a research base in Antarctica. As you're starting to think about press and touring, how do you feel about the press side of publishing, to sort of doing interviews, events, all of that? Is that something that you enjoy?
it is something that I enjoy, and I feel lucky in that sense because I know it is very difficult for a lot of writers who are uncomfortable with that more public facing side. And I grew up really in love with many forms of the arts. I was a pretty serious dancer, and I also did some acting, and I don't do those things anymore. But I think the promotional side allows me to tap into that a little bit. If I'm giving a reading, there's a performative quality to it. And I find it really fulfilling to be able to talk with readers and hear how the book is landing for people, especially because I work on a pretty long timeline. So this book I
Mm.
began in 2020 and it's coming out, in late 2026. So by the time the book comes out, it's like I'm excited to be able to be in that space more, but I also have really struggled from a health perspective with the demands of being a kind of a public face for the book. My first novel, The Anatomy of Dreams, was what we call in the industry a quiet publication, which is a nice way of saying it did not sell many copies.
Mm.
And so my second book I was lucky to have a publisher that was really excited about it. And I felt like this is my chance because I hadn't established myself more widely with the first book. And so I kind of said yes to everything and struggled with establishing boundaries when I was having more and more health impacts, which for me took the form of chronic migraine. And it took a long time to crawl out of that. So I guess it's kind of a weird combination in me in that I really do enjoy this part, but also I can push myself to the point where I'm I'm not doing it sustainably. And so I'm hoping to find that balance better with this publication.
That's interesting. I knew that about you, that and you've been open about sort of your struggles with migraines. It seems like things have gotten better. I think I didn't realize until recently that that sort of was born out of touring the Immortalists. Are you approaching, touring differently given that experience last time? I'm sure you have sort of coping mechanisms that you've developed over the last several years.
Yeah, it's a number of different things. I finally found a treatment that worked for me after many years of not having anything that did. And so that is really my foundation. And if there's anyone who has chronic pain who's listening to this, Lin Health, LIN Health is the program that I did. It's kind of a cognitive behavioral approach to chronic pain that completely changed my life. So I want to mention that if it could be useful to anyone else. But also, yes, I had plans to sort of work with my publisher to find ways of touring that were more sustainable for me. But also, it's been really interesting to realize how much the industry has changed since 2018 when Immortalist came out. There's so much less touring happening. And it's not as though social media didn't exist and we only had IRL experiences and
Hmm.
touring was the only way to publicize a book. But now I think it's much more the case that marketing and publicity are putting their focus on digital opportunities. So my publisher's hopes for my tour are much more limited. And that was kind of an interesting thing to discover. And I think I spent so much time sort of afraid of like, okay, how am I going to set boundaries this time and say no to things? And then it turned out that that's not going to be necessary because I'm going to be doing a much more limited tour. And I should
Sure.
say I was incredibly lucky to have the opportunities that I did for Immortalist. It was a dream come true in so many ways, and the chance to meet that many independent booksellers, connect with bookstores, like that's something that I think laid the foundation for my career. And I'm so thankful that I had the publisher support to do that kind of travel at the time.
Yeah. I know you won't say it. I'll say, I think a lot of readers don't sort of realize like what a sort of dog and pony show it is. If you're lucky enough to have, a great book that reaches a lot of people, like it can be pretty grueling, it seems, to be put on that kind of tour. I know that you approach it with the utmost of professionalism, though. And I know another thing I should say about this book is like, again, I was blown away within 20 pages about how sort of lived in the world felt. I don't think that you have been a researcher in Antarctica. In my mind, the fanciest thing about you is not that you're a best-selling author. I think it's like you had a research assistant for this book. Uh,
That's such a like writer core.
hmm.
Yes, I know. It was the first time I had a research assistant. It is so fancy. I was like, this is a privilege. And like, thank you, Immortalist, for giving me the ability to hire someone. So yeah, shout out to my research assistant, Alyssa Adams, Dr. Alyssa Adams. They are absolutely phenomenal. And yeah, I have not been a researcher in Antarctica. The research for this book was so much fun and so absorbing, and I'm really thrilled that it felt lived in because that's exactly what I wanted. I love books that feel incredibly immersive and transportive, and that is something that I wanted to offer the reader in terms of the world building. The true VIP for the Antarctic research is someone named Brian Bilazel. And Brian, if you ever hear this and I've mispronounced your last name, I'm so sorry because I realize that I've only seen it in writing. But I contacted the National Science Foundation, which runs the US research base in Antarctica called McMurdo, and I asked if they could connect me to someone who would be willing to talk with me about that experience. And I should say that no one can visit Antarctica unless they are working on a research base. So you
Mm.
can go on a cruise, but I don't know that you can make landfall, but it's not a place that anyone can visit, and I could afford a research assistant but not a cruise. So they connected me with Brian, who had been a steward in Antarctica. And what that means is you work in the kitchen, which is the same thing that my character does. And I sent him a bunch of questions, and Brian sent back a writer's dream, which was like over 30 single space pages of information about what it
Wow.
was like to live on base. And he wound up being an amazing source throughout the project. I spoke with a few other people who had lived on base. I spoke with the dive supervisor, so the person who runs the dive program at McMurdo, which, if you've gotten to that part,
Hmm.
so you'll know kind of how pivotal that was. And it was funny because this won't necessarily make sense unless people have read the book, but I don't think it's a spoiler either. He was the one who told me like it would actually be really easy for people to sneak off and do a dive because we leave the
Mm.
key in the ignition and the dive locker's unlocked. And so, things like that, that if I had written it, people might have thought, oh, that can't possibly be true. She's being lazy. And I'm like, well, listen, Rob Robbins told me of McMurdo's dive program.
There you go. I mean, if nothing else, it gives you the peace of mind, because people
Yeah,
probably aren't having
true.
those thoughts, but you can be rest assured. I had assumed McMurdo was a sort of made up name for a research facility.
No, yeah. And the scientific teams that I write about, Anita and Ice Cube, both of which are doing experiments with neutrinos, are real programs, but totally fictionalized within the novel.
I feel like readers have such a fixation too on like what's real, what's sort of taken from, especially when it comes to writing about real places. There's so much science in this book. There also was in your first book, and in some ways in the Immortalist. Were you a science kid growing up? Like, where does this sort of come from?
So, no, I was not a science kid, and it's really a baffling thing to me that I've been so drawn to it in adulthood. I think I'm just fascinated by the world at the risk of sounding kind of basic. And I'm fascinated by the line between what we know and what we don't. And so things like magic and spirituality and science all feel like different ways of approaching the question of the unknown. And so I think that's why I often write about those subjects. And this kinds of science that I think I tend to write about are kind of um, uh, areas that look at existential questions, or there's something kind of philosophically interesting about it to me, whether that's dreams in my first book, or longevity, human aging in Immortalists, or in this book, kind of cosmology and the question of what might be beyond our world. So I think I come at it from a humanities angle, but then I'm also very obsessive about wanting the world to feel real. And so then I kind of set myself the assignment of trying to ground it in real science as much as possible so that it does feel really plausible. And I don't know why I feel the need to do that. I feel like if people want to skim, they can, but I want to write for the reader who wants it all in the way that I do. I could see this book being written in a way where you take a lot of that out, but it wouldn't be written by me.
Yeah. Is it fair to say you love a challenge too?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I think if I feel confident that I can pull a book off when I start, I'm not interested enough to keep going for the, 5+ years that it's going to take me. So I do want to be working at the edge of my ability and sort of even though it can be stressful. And I have had a book that I set aside because lo and behold, I couldn't pull it off. It still feels like the place that I want to be working in.
I think we're doing a good job of talking about this without spoiling things. I will
Good.
continue to try to do that.
Yes.
Without getting into spoilers. It's fair to say, I think, that the book deals with the idea of sort of wanting to undo or revisit the past in some way. I'm curious if you could return to a moment in your own life, what would
Mm.
that be and why?
Oh my gosh, I'm going to get this question so much. I just realized, not that it's not original or a good question, but with Immortalists, it was
That's
like,
fine. We'll be the
it,
first.
you still get the credit. With Immortalists, the question was if you could know the date of your death, would you want to?
Right.
Oh gosh. So to change it or just to like re-experience it?
Either, I think. Yeah.
Mm. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is to be with my grandmother, who
Mm,
it really inspired the character of Gloria. And she died in 2019, very, shortly before I started this book. And I think the character of Gloria was an attempt at preserving her. So, I mean, I'm lucky not to have like a terrible regret in my life that I would want to go
mhm.
back and change. So I think it would be more about like pleasure, being with someone.
It's funny that you said, I understand why you were getting that question about the immortalist. It's sort of like a tagline for the book almost. But as a reader, I'm reading it, I'm thinking this is a person who thinks a lot about aging,
Mm,
thinks a lot about the span of our lives. Where
yeah.
does that come from?
Mm. That's a great question. I don't entirely know. I think at the risk of sounding precious, there is something about artists that is very sensitive to life itself, I guess. I mean, my mom describes like even as a baby, the kind of hypersensitivity that I had, and I think I've just always been unable to shut out the absurdity of life, which is that we are supposed to continue on and make plans for the future without having any sense of whether, we'll be there to see it or when our lives will end. It's kind of
Mm,
this insane contract that nobody agrees to sign, and yet we all come into the world, and must abide by it. And I'm lucky that both my mom and my dad are doing okay at the moment, but they both have cancer. I lost my stepmom about a year ago to a difficult dementia.
mm,
And so, I think when you have people in your immediate family who are navigating health issues, that's tough. And also probably the migraines. I mean, they really came to a head at a totally different level of severity after Immortalists, but I've had them since I was about 13. And the loss of
mm.
time that you experience when you have a chronic condition is really devastating. I mean, just whole days of incapacitation. So I think that made me very anxious about how much time I have, how much time I have feeling good. But then it's like, did I have that physical manifestation because I've been a worrier about those things since, you know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like it's hard to know how it all connects. Sometimes I wish I was able to not think about those things more. And I guess at least I have writing to process them.
Yeah, I mean, that's my thought is like what a gift it is to have fiction as a tool to sort of work these things out and to play in the world of metaphor.
Yes, yes. Just before we got on this call, I was working on my newsletter and I'm writing a bit about an exhibit I saw at the Tate Britain when I was in London of Lee Miller's work. Are you familiar with Lee Miller?
No, I'm not.
I'll make this quick because I know this is not our subject, and she's not a Wisconsin artist. She's actually born in Poughkeepsie, which is really funny because I went to college at Vassar in Poughkeepsie. But anyway, she had a fascinating life. She began as a fashion model and then went behind the lens and became a surrealist photographer in the 30s, working with people like Man Ray. And then she became a war photographer during the 40s, photographed the war in Britain and ultimately concentration camps when the prisoners were freed. And she, after experiencing that horror, she basically lost her passion for photography. And it was
Hmm.
kind of like her own relationship to her art, or her ability to find respite in it, was what she sacrificed. That was like the cost of seeing what she did. And it made me feel so sad, because obviously the greater tragedy in this story is World War II itself and what happened in the camps. But there's also this personal tragedy of, she was then without the thing that, at least in my life, has brought me comfort in my most difficult periods. I just found that so impactful. And actually, she never wanted her work to get out there. Nobody really knew who she was. And then after she died, her son found all these negatives. It just made me think about how important my art has been as an outlet. And you sort of realize, like, well, yeah, if I were a few clicks, you know, more one way, like, I could really struggle in the way of some other artists, kind of mentally, to handle the world.
I want to switch gears a little bit and move away from Understory and talk to you about living in Madison. So you moved to Madison for your MFA. What were your first impressions of the place?
Uh, Well, partly you're getting me a year after moving away, so I'm probably going to be really seeing things through rose-colored glasses, because I'm still processing my move, but also it is just a freaking wonderful place to live. I moved there after straight from college, and I assumed I would just do my 2 years, and then, head either back to San Francisco or maybe to New York, because I was interested in the publishing world. And I just fell in love with it. I think, the slower pace of life there was really good for me as an ambitious person who can kind of overwork myself. I think I just felt there was a real, like, small city warmth and vibrancy. The bit that I read of Hannah's book is very reminiscent of my own MFA experience. There's these beautiful lakes and coffee shops and fried cheese curds, and, this, like, kind of thriving university culture. And it's not to say that Madison doesn't have, its own hypocrisies and issues, but I found it a really, like, soft place to land at that point in my life.
You've written now sort of two books that are set in some way in Madison. So your debut, you wrote about Madison. I think it's, again, not a spoiler to say there's some Madison in this book as well. I find that totally fascinating. When I first started writing fiction, I was living in New York and then in North Carolina, and I was writing mostly about Wisconsin. And I think that's fairly common for people to sort of write about the place that they call home. But, for you to be sort of a transplant, and clearly it left enough of a sort of impression on you to turn it into fiction. Like, what is it about this place, do you think, that made it feel like fertile ground for that kind of
Mhm.
storytelling?
First of all, when I encounter somewhere new, it's kind of like all your senses are turned on, and you see things in a
Mm.
fresh way that it can be harder to do with the place that you come from. So, little details like on the east side, I would say 70% of people had a couch on their front porch. It's
Hmm.
like, why? And so they're just things that I kind of noticed in a way that I might not if I'd come from that place. And I think that that's a big part of the reason that I wrote about Madison initially, is just that kind of absorption. But I also think it's a really interesting place, because it's obviously a very purple state, and you have the tension between Madison itself and Milwaukee as these progressive hubs, and then you have a much more rural and, to some extent, conservative leaning populace in the rest of the state. You have an agricultural history, an environmentalist history, but also a real, like, activist history through the UW. So it's not just one thing. I think there's a lot of different threads that wind through Wisconsin that sort of echo the larger complexity and history of the country.
You do something really cool too, which is that you pick out real houses that would
Yeah.
belong to your characters. I think
Yeah.
that's so interesting. Can you talk about that and why it's part of your process?
Yeah, I love that you found that. So for when I was writing Anatomy of Dreams, which is about a couple that is doing dream research under a charismatic but ethically questionable professor, I was riding the bus back from campus to the east side, the same kind of walking route that Hannah talks about in the excerpt that I read. And I was thinking about this novel and I forgot to get off. I didn't get off at my stop. And so I had to stay on the bus for it to go all the way to the, turnaround point and come back around. And so only because that happened did we pass these two houses that I wound up putting my characters in. And then in Understory, there is also, yeah, a specific house that is because the protagonist in Understory, whose name is Laurel, grows up on an orchard. And that orchard is based on a place called Door Creek Orchard, which is, I think, technically in Cottage Grove, where I had picked apples for 10 plus years before the thought of putting it into a novel ever occurred to me. And they have this wonderful old farmhouse that the family has lived in with all kinds of quirks. And so when I started interviewing the Griffith family who own and founded the orchard about their lives, and they told me about the farmhouse, I was like, oh my gosh, this is so good. I suppose there's something I like about the overlap of fiction and real life. Like for me, in the same way that I want to create an immersive experience for the reader, I love to have an immersive experience as the writer. So for this book, I did a
Mm.
lot of hands-on research. I went to Minnesota to shadow scientists in caves. I followed a fungi lab on a foraging expedition. I went to a women's mushroom conference in Governor Dodge State Park. It's almost like I like to trick myself into believing that the boundaries between what I'm imagining and what really is are permeable. And so I think that's probably why I do so much scientific research. And that's probably also why I like to identify real landmarks and then kind of give them a second life.
I love too sort of the idea in fiction of creating worlds within a world and your own sort of place that's specific to your novel, but sometimes you need real places to ground that
Hmm.
work and make it real for you too. Finally, I think for people who might not know, because you spent so much time here, and I think you did some great things to create community here, what would you want people to sort of understand about the writing scene here in Madison and in Wisconsin at large?
Mm. I mean, just that it's so rich and vibrant. I am very passionate about setting people straight when they make dismissive comments about the Midwest or about flyover states, because there are so many incredibly interesting people who live in those states. It really changed me to move away from the coast with all of its glamour and excitement, but also it can be kind of narrow in its way, and to get to know different kinds of people. I mean, there's just an incredibly, I keep using the word vibrant, but vibrant writing scene in Madison. There's reading series, there's wonderful independent bookstores. As we've talked about, there's great coffee shops. And I think all of that just creates a really fertile, exciting, and community driven writing world.
I want to steal from you. I've been trying to sort of end these episodes with a quick speed round,
Okay.
and
Oh,
I
fun.
I went to a reading, a sort of book launch event for Christina Clancy that you had moderated, and you did a series of either or questions.
Yeah.
I'd like to do that with you now.
Great. I love that.
And some of these we'll start with some sort of old place, new place questions. So,
Okay.
Culver's or In and Out?
Culver's.
Mm. Madison sourdough, or is it boudin or boudin?
Yeah.
Boudin?
Okay. Yeah. It's people say Bodine, but I think
Hmm.
that's wrong. Like a French person would not say it that way.
Yeah,
Ooh,
yeah,
that's so good. Okay, so now you're confusing me. Boudin
boudin. Hmm.
is a San Francisco sourdough. Oh my gosh. That's so cruel. I'm gonna have to go Boudin just because it's my childhood, but I love Madison sourdough.
How about a snowy winter walk or a foggy San Francisco morning?
Oh, oh my gosh. That's really hard because did you know that I hate sunny weather? And so were you making this question extra hard?
I was thinking about you, sure.
Wow. Oh man. I mean, I feel like I'm betraying my upbringing if I don't say fog, but I have had a really tough time emotionally this winter, I will say. I'm
Mm,
missing Wisconsin. We've had a really kind of scarily warm winter in the Bay Area, and I love winters in Wisconsin. So I beg, like, can I have like one pass?
sure. We'll
Okay,
give you a
that would
pass
be
on
it.
that one. And I'll move away from San Francisco, Wisconsin questions a little bit. Character first or plot first?
Mm. I think character, but I find that when I have an idea for a novel, it's both together. There's
Mm,
usually a nub that is intertwined.
sure. Big ideas or intimate moments?
Oh, well, you know I have to say both for that. That's like my whole
Hmm.
thing.
Okay, here's one. Knowing the ending before you start or figuring it out late.
Oh, gosh. Knowing the ending, which I feel makes me sound like less open to discovery during the writing process than I am because I hold it very loosely, but I
Mm,
do like to know. I don't necessarily know everything along the way, but I like to have a rough sense of arc and where the book is going.
yeah, that makes sense. One sort of philosophical one that I feel like thematically maybe ties into your books. Control or surrender?
Oh, well, aspirationally surrender, realistically struggling.
Mm, mm. Yeah, same, same.
Yeah.
Last one. Time
Okay.
travel to the past or time travel to the future?
Mm. Probably the past because I think the future scares me. Like there's so much that I don't like about how things seem to be going, but I've always desperately wanted to know about life on other planets. Are there aliens and what are they like? If I could ask one question of the universe before I die, it would be that. And so if I could go into the future just to know that, then I would 100% pick that.
Come back in 2 years for Chloe's new book on alien life on Mars. Chloe, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jeff. This was so fun.
One more big thanks to my guest, Chloe Benjamin. And thank you for tuning in. You can find Chloe online and sign up for her newsletter at chloebenjaminbooks.com. And if you enjoyed this episode, please leave a rating or share it with a friend. It really helps. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new episodes. They come out every Wednesday. You can reach me anytime at jeffaloizia.com/writing forward. That's JEFFOLOIZIA.com/writing forward. I'd love to hear from you. This episode was recorded at the Madison Public Library with support from Dane Arts. It was produced, edited, and mixed by Anya Van Wagtendonk. The theme music is by the Lola Ombre. Our logos and episode art are by Tim Burton. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you next time.